We're going? Okay. Hi, my name is Taylor Brown, and I am going to show you my concept map for my chemistry definitions. Let's start at the top. Okay. So, first we have our two big categories. Organic chemistry, which is the study of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms, basically all your organic materials. And then come over here, inorganic chemistry, which is the rest of it. Now, both of these categories all study atoms. And atoms is basically the center of chemistry. And that's why it's in the center of my map. Okay, let's talk about structure of an atom first. An atom has a nucleus, which is the center of an atom, and an electron cloud that encircles the atom. Our nucleus is consistent of neutrons, which are neutrally charged particles, and protons that are positively charged particles. Now, those two together give you your atomic weight, and your atomic weight is of your atom. And that is measured in daltons. Now, on further, your atomic weight and your molecular weight are basically the same thing. Now we come down to what's called a mole. And a mole is a measurement of your molecular weight in reference to the carbon atom. Now, what I mean by that is your carbon atom has 12 grams per mole. And that's kind of just a universal tool to measure the atoms in 1 mole of all other elements. And that gives you your Avogadro's number. Avogadro's number is 6 times 10 to the 23rd atoms, and that's how many atoms is in 1 mole of carbon. Back up to moles, another measurement that you use is called molarity. Molarity is moles per liter. That's how you measure the concentration of a specific substance in liquid. Okay, now back up to protons. As I said before, protons are positively charged particles. Now, the number of protons in an atom gives you your atomic number. Atomic number is an easy way to identify specific elements. For example, oxygen has an atomic number of 8. That means oxygen has 8 protons in that molecule. Okay, now back to your nucleus and your electrons in the middle, what consists of your atoms. Now, a little bit more complicated subject is your electrons. Electrons are constantly orbiting in the form of a cloud. Closer you get to the nucleus, your electrons are kind of tightly bound and attracted to those positive charges. So that brings our attention to electron shells. Electron shells are basically how electrons orbit about the nucleus. Now, the closer you get to the nucleus, you have electron shells that you can only keep small amounts of electrons in. The farther away that you get, you can have more electrons per shell. Now, this brings our attention to valence electrons. Valence electrons are the very outer shell of a specific element and how many more electrons you need to fill that shell. So, for instance, you have oxygen. Oxygen has 2 valence electrons due to the fact that 2 of its electrons go in the first electron shell, and you have 4 more valence electrons in the second shell, which would leave 2 more because it has 8 electrons total. Okay, so back up to electrons and talking about some of the reactions that electrons do in atoms. When you come down to your oxidation reduction reactions, that's when electrons are shared between the reactants and the products. So you have your specific atoms that are electron donors that wants to give up 1 or 2 electrons to fill their electron shell, and you have electron acceptors such as fluorine, who has 7 electrons, and they need 1 more electron to fill that electron shell, which is 8. Okay, so back up to atoms. We're going to start talking about how 2 atoms make a bond. So that means that when 2 atoms are attracted to each other, whether it be through their electrons, protons, or just their structure in general, they can make a bond. Now, there are different types of bonds between different types of atoms. First, we have our ionic bonds. Ionic bonds means that the transfer of electrons is completely moved when those 2 atoms are bonded together. So, for instance, say you have a hydrogen that's bonded to a fluorine. Your hydrogen atom is going to completely transfer its extra electron to the fluorine. It's not going to share. Talking about sharing, we have our covalent bonds. Covalent bonds share electrons. And we have many types of those covalent bonds. We have a triple bond, which each atom will donate 3 electrons to be shared. A double bond, which each atom will donate 2 electrons to be shared, and polar and nonpolar bonds. A polar bond is when 2 atoms are bonded together and one atom is more electronegative than the other, meaning that most of the electron weight is teetered over to that more electronegative atom. And nonpolar bonds is where those 2 electrons are equally shared. And lastly, we talk about our hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds is when a hydrogen is bonded to an electronegative atom. So take water, for instance. Water is oxygen that's bonded to 2 hydrogens. Now, those 2 hydrogens are hydrogen bonds because oxygen is a very electronegative atom. And thus, we have our hydrogen bond network, meaning that those 2 hydrogen bonds make water a very polar molecule. And when more than one water molecule are together, that gives you cohesion. And through those bonds, those water molecules will stick together. And that also leads to the conversation about adhesion, because after those 2 molecules are sticky and stick together, you have something that's called surface tension. And that is adhesion. Okay, back up to water, you have something that's called a water isotope. And we'll talk about isotopes when we get back over to our neutron section. But an isotope is when you have the same atom, carbon, oxygen, for instance, but they have different numbers of neutrons. So in water, when we talk about the water isotope, you have oxygen that is normally oxygen 16 actually, and can also have oxygen 18, different number of neutrons. Okay, so we kind of got that. Okay, let's go back up to protons. Okay, now more on protons and more on the reactions that take place in different types of atoms. So we go down here and we have specific types of protons that are either proton acceptors or proton donors. And these are those types of atoms that will make either an acid or a base. When I say proton, I'm talking about specifically a hydrogen atom. A hydrogen can be donated, which makes it an acid, or can be accepted, which makes it a base. Now, when an acid and a base are put together, it makes a salt. That's a neutral compound, which makes this a cation, which is a positive ion, and an anion, which is a negative ion. Both of these makes a salt. Okay, back to our acids. Our acids come in the form in reaction of hydronium ions. So take water for instance. When you add a hydrogen ion to water, you make acid. An acid is therefore measured in solution by something that's called pH. pH is the measurement of the hydronium ion in the substance. Okay, so enough about acids. Let's go back up here to our central unit and talk about elements. Elements are those substances that cannot be broken down any further in reaction. So a few elements that we're going to talk about. I need to drink water. Okay, a few elements that we're going to talk about are those that consist in our body and in nature for this class. So we have oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, sulfur, sodium, chlorine, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. All of those things is which our body needs to survive. And speaking of elements, we're going to talk about when elements are joined together, it's going to make compounds. And compounds is simply two or more elements joined together. And those brings to our functional groups, which is what we see a lot when dealing with things in our body as well. And a few functional groups that we're going to talk about is hydroxyl, which is an OH molecule, or carbonyl, which is a C carbon double bonded to an oxygen, a carboxyl, which is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen bonded to another oxygen, an amino, which is a nitrogen bonded to a hydrogen, a sulfohydryl, which is a sulfur bonded to a hydrogen, a methyl, which is a simple carbon bonded to 3 other hydrogens, and a phosphate, which is a large ion that's basically bonded from a phosphorus to an oxygen. Okay, starting with our hydroxyls. Hydroxyls, when bonded to another carbon alkane group or alkene, makes alcohols. And I don't know what that is. Okay, so our hydroxyls, we're going to move on to more specifically sugars and amino acids and lipids. Hydroxyls make monosaccharides. Monosaccharide is the basic form of a carbohydrate. And a carbohydrate is basically sugar. So 2 monosaccharides or more makes a polysaccharide. And those are the monomers of this big polymer called a carbohydrate that our cells need to make energy. So now we're going to go back to our functional groups and go to carbonyls, which are C double bonded to an O, and those give you 2 other functional groups called ketones, which is a C double bonded to an O that on either side is bonded to another carbon group, and then aldehydes is a C bonded to an O, bonded to another alkane that's bonded to a hydrogen. All right, and those 2 molecules also make a monosaccharide. So monosaccharides are basically consisted of either a ketone or aldehyde connected to a long chain of carbon and hydrogens that's connected to a hydroxyl. Okay, another functional group is what's called a carboxyl. And a carboxyl is the basic form of a carboxylic acid. A carboxylic acid basically just has another carbon group, alkane, alkene, whatever have you, attached to that. And our carboxylic acids are pretty important in cell biology because they make a lot of basic compounds that we need to survive. For instance, a carboxylic acid, if you follow this line, makes a fatty acid. And a fatty acid is the basic form of a lipid. Lipids and glycolipids, basically the same thing but with a glycerol, are very hydrophobic. So they have a lot to do with how our cells can accept certain molecules that are in the form of fats. Back to fatty acids. Fatty acids can come in two ways, either saturated with no double or triple bonds anywhere on the molecule, or unsaturated, which means there's at least one double bond among the fatty acid. Okay, so our fatty acids are the basis of our lipids, and our lipids can make glycolipids, phospholipids, which also have glycerol in them. These are just different type of lipids that makes up that certain category. Okay, back to carboxylic acid, and one of our important parts that we need in our bodies. Carboxylic acid is a basic functional group of what's called an amino acid. Amino acid is another monomer for a protein. And this amino acid is made by carboxylic acid and amines, which is the basic form of an amino. Now, multiple amino acids is what makes a protein. Proteins are very useful in our bodies. They basically run our bodies. Now, when you mix a protein with a fatty acid, that gives you a glycoprotein. Glycoproteins are very abundant on the outside of our cells in our phospholipid bilayer that lets certain molecules in and out of our cells. Okay, so lastly, we're going to come back over to our sugar, and that's going to come all the way down here to our nucleotides. Now, nucleotides are the basis of our DNA. A nucleotide consists of a phosphate group, a sugar, and a base. A base is not mentioned here, but we'll find out about those later in class. But anyways, so a nucleotide, multiple nucleotides that are on the basis of our DNA makes a nucleic acid. All right, well, bring it back to me. Okay, well, that is the end of my concept map, and I'm very interested in seeing the rest of our labs and seeing what else this class has to offer me.